Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back. Jesus loves you. So, there's this series on Netflix called Into the Fire, The Lost Daughter. It's an insane story, true story, documentary about a family that lost their 14-year-old daughter who was murdered. And I want to talk about it from a Christian angle, political, spiritual, biblical, etc. Human, right? Humanity. I'm going to talk about mental illness, abuse, essay. It's going to be triggering, trigger warning. Yeah. So, really sad story. Pretty wild. Truth is stranger than fiction. This is definitely an example of that. Basically, this woman gets pregnant when she's 16. Her mom essentially tells her to give up the baby. She does. She's then in her 50s. She gets a letter asking for her DNA because they found a dead body of a 14-year-old girl, but it was 20 years after the fact. And they thought it might be her daughter. Turns out it wasn't, but she gets involved with some internet sleuths who are looking at cold cases, finds out her daughter was raised by this Christian couple. They changed her name and everything. She found out. And she finds out that the father of said Christian couple has a really bad criminal record of all kinds of violent sexual crimes towards women, as well as attempted murder of teenagers. And she also meets people who have been victims of this guy. She finds the house, starts basically flyering and putting it all over online that she believes that this guy murdered her daughter. There's a lot more to it, but I'm just getting to the cut the chase, you know. She goes by the house. She sees the backyard. She says, she's buried back there. I know it. My daughter's back there. She knew somehow, intuitively, the mother's intuition that her daughter was back there. Crazy story, because it turns out in the very end of the 2-episode series on Netflix, she was correct. And nobody believed her. The guy she was working with, who was an internet sleuth, the detectives who were, they even, I think they had a warrant and they went in his backyard and they didn't find anything. But eventually they had to get an excavator, some archaeologists, and in the end she was correct. She was back there. Or I should say her body was back there. She herself was probably in heaven, right? So, it's an extremely sad but also interesting case. Because if you look at all three people, you see very interesting things going on each side, as well as the way that society failed all three of these people. Okay, first, the daughter who was, you find out, murdered by the father. He was very abusive to her. She claimed that he SA'd her, right? He molested her. And he was also physically abusing her. She left the house and stayed in her friend's closet for like 3 days. The friend was giving her food. The friend said, I think we should go to the principal, go to somebody. So they go to the principal of their school. The principal brings in the cops. The cops bring in the parents and say to the girl, what do you have to say? Of course, like any human being is going to clam up, especially if they're being abused by those people. And they know what's going to happen if they say this in front of them, right? So there's no anonymity. And of course, she didn't say anything. So boom, right there, the system failed her. The system is supposed to protect children from predators. A lot of times this doesn't happen. Second time society failed her. So she went, after that, they brought her back into the home with the abusers, right? The mother probably had a feeling something was going on, turned her head, was the enabler. There is a triangle of trauma. You need three people to keep this trauma cycle going, right? You have the perpetrator, the victim, and the enabler. There's usually those three. The enabler turns their head, even though they know deep down, the Holy Spirit probably is telling them, no, something is wrong. But for various reasons, often trauma on their own side that they haven't dealt with, they let it go. So that's what happened in this case. Second time society failed this girl was the church. She went to her pastor, right? They were brought up in a church. They were very religious, very Christian. The mother especially. She quotes scripture a lot in the documentary. They bring her to a pastor. She tells the pastor what's going on. My father's doing this thing to me. The pastor brings in the parents, just like the principal did in the school. And he says to her, what do you have to say to your parents? The girl ends up saying, I'm sorry, I lied, right? So obviously the pastor counseled her to say that and convinced her that she was making it up. And as Sigmund Freud said, oh no, it was just your projected desires on your, all that nonsense that Freud came up with the second time, right? The first Freud theory was, mental illness is caused by early childhood trauma. That was the correct one. But what you had happen was a bunch of people were abusing their kids, in particular their daughters. Men were abusing their daughters. They found out about Freud's theory, and they said, we're not having that. So they said, revise it. And Freud came out with the second theory, which essentially blames the victim. No, you weren't actually abused. Those memories you're having, flashbacks, that's your own desire that you're, projecting onto your parent. The Oedipus complex, the Oedipal complex, the Alexa complex, complete nonsense garbage. And they teach this stuff. But the original theory, Freud was on point. So this happens a lot with abuse survivors. They speak up. They're told, you're crazy, you're a liar, you wanted it, you tempted, all kinds of stuff. And Christians do this stuff. We know this. It's been going on for thousands of years. It's not beyond anybody. It's very sad. And sometimes people use the Bible to justify, right, to shield people from responsibility. They use the church to shield people from responsibility, right? So instead of going to the police or the authorities, no, we'll go internally through the church. And this is often how abuse continues to be perpetrated. Now, another quick thing is, it was a right-wing town, and right-wing politics really doesn't lend itself to justice for children or children's rights, or women's rights for that matter. Specifically with kids, if you look at the right-wing states, they believe in parents' rights over and above children's rights. And this is a big thing with the transgender thing, right? In the liberal cities, they're saying, well, a child should be allowed to, whatever it is. Some people are saying they say they should be able to change their gender, or if they're confused about their gender, the teacher shouldn't have to report it to the parent, right? Things like that. I'm not equating that necessarily. I'm just saying that's a similar issue of parents' rights versus child rights. But children's rights and child protection didn't exist until the 1800s, until the liberal ideas and people who wanted to help children made it happen. Okay, so in America, which was largely Christian, it was largely parents' rights. And they can base that on the commandments. They can base that on, spare the rod, spoil the child. There's a lot of verses that people tend to say, well, you got to do what your parent says, and even more extreme ones in the Old Testament, which I won't go into, right? The punishment for an unruly child. But we don't live under the old covenant anymore. We live under the new covenant. Now, there are many Bible verses in the Bible that say, don't harm your children, right? He who troubles his own family shall inherit the wind. If you mess with your children and trouble them, they're not going to be around. You're inheriting nothing. Dust. Bye-bye. Right? So a lot of times we hear this, we did this for you, and you're just going to put us in a home? You're not going to take care of us in our old age? Well, how did you treat that person? Do you think somebody's going to want to take care of you? If you took care of them, you put a shelter over their head, but what else was going on there? So oftentimes you see people putting shelter over their parents' heads and putting them in a home. Hey, we're paying for you to be here, but I don't want to you didn't take very good care of me. Anyway, that's a whole thing. And as Christians, we decide what we want to do with all that. But it's interesting that the liberal places are the ones that are states' rights, or child's rights rather, saying, hey, parents don't have the right to do whatever they want to their child, as sometimes the right-wing states will believe, right? Whether it's education, medical. Obviously, nobody's saying, they should be allowed to abuse the child, but even in physical abuse, there's debate about that. Well, can I strike my child? I believe I should be able to strike my child. Okay, But now there are laws, in America at least, if you do physical harm that leaves a mark, that is called physical abuse. You cannot do that. Sexual abuse is obviously zero tolerance, right? There's penalty for that. Now, most right-wingers, I think, would agree to that, and I'm not saying that they're okay with that. However, it is true that in patriarchal society, in right-wing society, in theocracies, essentially the man rules, and you don't really question. That also goes on with the mother. The mother was in a position of, he's my husband, I don't question him, I'm never going to divorce, God hates divorce, Jesus says it. These are all biblical things. So you have both those things. There's this idea that it takes a village to raise a child, not just the parents, right? Back in the biblical days, it wasn't just the parents. It was a whole unit. It was a whole family, right? Now, I even heard of recently, in other countries and in America, oftentimes a woman get married to a family in a sense, right? She's getting married to a man, but she's marrying into the family. And if there's abuse, there were other people there who would take care of it. They wouldn't necessarily go to the cops right away, but they had enough strong enough family unit that they would deal with it, right? The men in the family or the women, whoever, would get together and shake this guy up and give him a talking to, whatever it is. They might even threaten for her to leave. Hey, look, you better shape up. You don't treat her this way, right? This is not what we do in this family. We're not going to tolerate it. What has happened is the family system has become so parsed out and thinned out that a lot of times we have to rely on the government. However, do we believe that the government should be stepping in when there's abuse and child abuse? I think at this point, most people, including all political views, would say, yeah, I think we need that. So there are issues with patriarchy, there's issues with matriarchy, there's issues with capitalism, communism. No political system is perfect. But if the system, the church, the school, the government, right, child protective services, etc., would have done their job better, if this girl would have been given therapy by the parents, if the parents would have listened, if the mother would have listened, right, if the father would have gotten help, we wouldn't maybe be where we are with this case. She might be alive today. That is the very, very sad thing. So now with the mother, one might think, well, what is wrong with her, right? Why would she ever stay with somebody like that? And on one hand, yes, that's true, right? On one hand, that's 100% true. She should have left him so that the daughter would potentially still be alive. By the way, you find out that this guy has killed multiple people later on in the series, and you're like, wow, okay? So the mother of the girl who got killed, who she only met her when she was a really infant baby, and that was it. She is fighting for justice for her daughter, and rightly so. She's angry. She's not necessarily a believer. And in a way, I can't really say for sure, but in one sense, non-believers have this idea of this world being it. Now, at the same time, she was saying that she's like an angel watching over me. So even people have those ideas too. And yes, we should fight for justice. We should do everything we can to protect people on this earth. At the same time, the Christian in the story, the woman was the wife of this guy who did all this horrible stuff, this criminal. She has the overall correct view of everything as far as spiritually. And I'm going to get into that later. So should she have left this guy? That's up to her. That's an individual choice. Everybody can sit here in judgment, armchair it as we're watching the show, right? As I'm watching, well, you should have done this. Oh, I would have done this. Or, well, but as I'm listening to this story, from everybody's point of view, minus the girl, unfortunately, we couldn't hear her point of view. However, we did hear from her friends, which was awesome, who were really close to her. I heard the woman's point of view, and I understood what she was saying, why she didn't leave. It might have been out of trauma. It might have been out of codependency. It might have been the wrong decision. However, I really understand where she's coming from. Her position was, after she heard the crimes, a lot of times she didn't believe it. She was always making excuses. But eventually she said, I don't know that person. Right? That's why she couldn't believe that he would do those things, because she literally doesn't know that person. She's never seen him do that. He has a separate life where he's doing this stuff, and while he's with her, he's a good husband. Now, there were issues with him abusing her in front of her physically. That calls into question, that's a red flag. However, again, especially in the Christian world, spare the rod, spoil the child. Hey, you know what? she's 13, 14. She's, she needs to be, really, we need to have some discipline in this house. So there's this rationalization that can go on very easily. But this idea that you shouldn't leave your husband, I don't agree with that. I've criticized many people for believing that. And John MacArthur, I think, overstepped his bounds when he shamed a woman publicly who wanted to leave her husband, who was being abusive to her and her daughter, I believe it was. Turns out the guy goes to prison for essaying the daughter. So yeah, maybe John MacArthur should have let up and allowed the woman to allow the Holy Spirit to say, you know what, this isn't working. It's not right for the child. It would be the more loving thing to get a divorce. Yes, it's against the law, but so is what the father is doing. So sometimes you have to break the law to save a life. You have to break the law to do the loving thing. And you have to break the law to prevent the law from being broken in some cases. So in the case where this woman is saying, I don't know that man, I don't know that person, right? Now this goes to another story I was watching about Ted Bundy, who had a long-term girlfriend while he was doing all these murders. When he goes to prison, she's in denial for a long time for the same reason. Ted Bundy was a really good father, potentially, at least that's what she says. If we can take her word for that, I don't see why we couldn't, to her young daughter at the time. There's pictures of them together. They seem very happy. Now, maybe something happened. We don't know. That's possible. But it's also possible that he was a good father and also a serial killer on the side. Now, a lot of times people can't understand that. I feel as Christians, we should be in a special position in a way to understand what that is. How is that even possible? Now, there are many reasons why. One includes psychology and the splitting of the brain, which I'm going to get into with the perpetrator. However, just on a biblical basis, look at David. Great king, man after God's own heart, sleeps with Bathsheba after seeing her bathing on the roof, right? Your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on the roof. Like that song, Hallelujah, by Leonard Cohen. Great song. She tied you to a kitchen chair. She broke your throne and cut your hair. So he mixes Samson and David, right? So David's this great guy, and yet he falls into this horrible sin. And okay, sleeping with a married woman is one thing. He murders the husband. What? Now, do you think that the wives of David and the children of David saw their father in that position? Oh, he's a murderer. He would kill somebody. And I'm not talking about in war capacity. I'm talking about specifically putting somebody in harm's way who didn't deserve it, who was a really faithful soldier, the husband of Bathsheba was. And he took that loyalty and betrayed him, and it was his own death, right? So we see this in the Bible, this duality of humanity. Humanity in general has this duality of being the absolute best and at the same time, the absolute worst. Now, sometimes, and I think people like to have it in boxes where you're either a good person or you're a monster. And I've always hated that term and that word that people use for people like serial killers, like Ted Bundy, etc. Or evil. No, nobody's evil. But there are humanity. Every person has within themselves the capacity to be very great, the greatest scholar, creating things, being an inventor, being a great parent, things like that. And also being an absolute horrible, the worst humanity. Hitler, Stalin, Ted Bundy, if you want to go there, right? Jeffrey Dahmer, et cetera, et cetera. So people like to think, oh, not me. I would never do that. And maybe you would never do that. That's great. However, you didn't have the life Jeffrey Dahmer did. Now, immediately people say, that's not an excuse. I had a horrible life. I didn't end up being a serial killer. Correct. It's not that everybody who has a bad life ends up being a serial killer, but I'll tell you this right now, and not everybody might agree with this, but I can say 100% certainly, if you are a serial killer, you had a really bad childhood. You had really traumatic things happen to you that you did not deal with. There's a reason why people are that sick. Now, this is where you get into people really don't care. The victim, yes, everybody's on board for that. And yes, I agree, we should be. And we should protect the victim. The woman, the daughter should have been protected. The wife, especially in Western understanding and law, a lot of times women were shielded from punishment in this case, this woman was too. She wasn't brought up on any charges, even though she may have known what was going on and didn't do anything. Whereas the mother and the birth mother said she should be brought up on charges. And many people who knew her were saying that as well. But in Western lawfare, they usually say, or it was very common that women would get out of things because, well, they were the weaker sex. Again, a biblical, not necessarily a biblical idea, but a Christian idea that people tend to get from their understanding of the Bible. Although I believe the Bible actually might specifically mention that. Not weaker, but maybe fairer sex. So because of that, they were manipulated by the man, so they should get off. There was a famous case in the UK about two serial killers. They were child murderers, a guy and a girl couple, and the guy went to jail for life, and the girl had, I don't know, a few years and got off because they literally thought, she didn't have control of her own mind. It was obviously the guy's ideas. Is it possible that a woman could be that messed up? The answer is yes, right? So with the wife not divorcing him, now she drops some really good scripture in there. And in the end, I believe her analysis in the spiritual sense and in the really was the long run sense was correct. It was that in the end, we're going to be okay. Right now, this is absolutely insane. This is one of the craziest stories you ever heard, right? The father ends up killing the daughter because the daughter is trying to run away. She's 14, nothing's working. She can't get away from this horrible, abuse that's happening. See, I paused there because I wanted to say this horrible person. And yes, maybe you could say they are a horrible person or they're acting horribly. Now that's better, acting horribly. The behavior is horrible. The person themselves is just a sinner just like everybody else. They're obviously very tortured, and there's a reason why they're doing what they're doing. They had some severe abuse. And again, this is where society failed the perpetrator. Now, obviously, once you're a perpetrator, you're in a different category. And that's where the law comes in and says, well, we don't care what happened to you. Often that might happen. However, there may be some leniency in law cases where they say, okay, you need to get help. If it's a really bad case, we're going to put you in a mental hospital. You're not going to be in society because you're a danger to society. But we don't think you should be in a prison. And that's a question of what is prison for? What is our criminal justice system for? Is it to just strictly punish? And that, again, is a right-wing idea. Yeah, we just want to punish. We don't want to reform. Well, then what are you really solving? The liberal or the progressive idea is, look, correction should be just that, correction. It's supposed to help them. So if they need therapy, they should get it. And oftentimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes it does. So the wife, in the end, ends up understanding, look, my daughter's going to be in heaven. She was devastated by this whole thing. She had no idea that the father killed her until 30, 40 years later when finally he's in prison for other murders and attempted rapes. Finally, she comes to some kind of term with that. And then he finally tells her, the daughter is buried in the backyard. I killed her. It was an accident, he says. She was leaving. She was attempting to leave. I said, you can't leave. I grabbed her. I hit her. She was at the top of the stairs. She fell, broke her neck. But then it gets even weirder. You would think after you did that, you'd call the cops. Well, no, he didn't. He hid the body and he stuffed her in a barrel. Trigger warning. And she wouldn't fit in the barrel, so he had to chop off her legs, he says. Now, come to find out, once they found the evidence, it was even worse than that. He was still softening it to his wife. He took her body and chopped it up into little pieces and put them in diaper bags to stop the smell potentially, and then buried it all in the backyard. Eventually, they burned her body. They had the cremation ashes. They split it up between the two mothers, which reminded me of Solomon. That was interesting. And that was a point of contention because the birth mother was angry. She said, how dare her say she's trying to cut her up again, right? She already had her husband cut her up, and now she wants to divide her body again. And they're at the sentencing of the father, who gets like 4 life sentences. He's found guilty for that again. And the mother, who's the Christian, says, I want to give you half the ashes. The birth mother's freaking out. I understand her position as well, obviously, right? Everybody's entitled to their view, and everybody's right in some way and wrong in other ways. And they ask her, do you want this half of the ashes or not? She stops, and I knew exactly what she was going to say. And she says, "Of course I do," and starts crying, right? Because yes, of course you do. So you take what you can get. It's like I said, it's extremely traumatic, but the Christian lady understood. My daughter's going to be in heaven with me and my husband, because she believes he was saved. And that is correct. That is the Christian view. This place is so messed up. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. You read about the EP files. This is a reality. This place is so bad. It's so horrible. I don't mean that in a nihilistic way. I just mean it's a very degraded place. The way just people are hurting and struggling and sinning and so I see society dropping the ball in all these situations. Now, what about the perpetrator? Did society drop the ball on the perpetrator? And the answer is yes, they did. If this guy got some help beforehand, maybe he reached out for help. And maybe he was denied help like the daughter was. It's extremely possible. As far as we've come in society, we don't understand, we don't even want to understand, many people don't care what makes a serial killer a serial killer. They're content to just say he's a monster, he's evil, we don't care what happened to you, throw him in jail forever or kill him, right? And that's what they ended up, he didn't get the death penalty, but he wanted to get transferred to another area so he could see his wife. And they even took that from him. And they said, no, we're not giving you anything. You're gonna suffer. To me, that is petty. All you're doing at that point is punishing the wife, and he had another kid. So they got pregnant with another kid right around the time where she disappeared. Like the kid was like 6 months. So, and they lied. I should have mentioned in the beginning. They lied about the murder. Obviously, the father buries the body and calls the cops immediately and says, or he hides the body first, calls the cops and says, hey, my daughter ran away. She took a bunch of money. He made up a total lie and kept the lie for decades. Now, as far as the perpetrator, obviously he's some sort of sociopath, psychopath, has all kinds of issues. That's obvious, right? And should he be locked up for life? Well, yes, obviously, because every time he's let out and he does more horrible crimes. So yes, he should be kept from society. But should he be given treatment? Should we study that? Should we try to make sure that other people don't do that? Absolutely. And that's where I think, again, the ball gets dropped when that's not happening. I mean, you're sitting there in prison for 4 life sentences. Might as well study this guy. Try to understand so that later, if we see the signs in somebody else, we can get them help or whatever it is. Put them in jail sooner so you can prevent whatever. Just learn. So what I saw with this guy was, and this was very interesting, I saw dissociative identity disorder. I saw which used to be called multiple personality disorder, MPD. Now it's called DID. And I saw him switch. And it's interesting because the series did not mention DID. There was no mention of any kind of diagnosis. This is me observing his behavior, seeing him switch from altar to altar, and realizing that he didn't even have memory, potentially, of this murder. Now, some people might say he's just making that up, and I understand that. However, when you watch this video with a keen eye, with an open heart and an open mind, you'll see, first of all, he's on death row. Well, he's not on death row, but he has 4 life sentences. He's not getting out. He meets this investigator who becomes very extremely friendly with him. He's closed off at first, but the investigator wants him to admit to the murder of his daughter and tell them where the body is buried. So he just approaches it as, I'm your best friend, I'm listening, I'll get you some food. He got him some coffee, took off his cuffs. The guy fell for it. He's calling his wife, yeah, the guy's so nice, he's talking to me. And what you have is a disarming situation where the person can really let go and tell the investigator what's going on in their mind and what they've done. This is a technique of investigation, of police force. Now, you know, it's good in a sense. However, because basically he was acting like a therapist. And what you see here is, because of that, even though he had an ulterior motive, and eventually once he got the info, he said, okay, we're going to lock you up for forever. Thank you very much, right? Kind of a cold thing to do if you ask me, but that's their business and that's fine. So, but because of the open way that he was just simply listening to him and just let him talk, he wasn't judgmental. What ends up happening in DID and dissociative identity disorder, when you have these alters, these parts of your mind, your psyche that are split off because of extreme trauma, right? We all tend to split off in general. It's called dissociation. We all do that. Dissociation disorder, and of course that's a spectrum. But in general, when something is so traumatic that the event itself is split off into somebody's mind, into some other area, so much so that sometimes the front, like the actual person's mind, can't handle it. So it assigns a certain name, identity, even age group to it, who holds the memory for them. And what you had happen here was, it's exactly what happened. That part that holds that information was able to come forward and speak to this investigator because he was so kind and so gentle and so judgment-free zone, completely accepting, not talking back. And another huge thing is believing. Now, oftentimes when people say things, people say, I don't believe you, right? That's what happens with kids when they're abused. The priest would never do that. Dad would never do that. You're a liar. Boom, immediately you shut down, and then kids tend to not tell anybody. There was a situation with this girl. She had another opportunity to tell other people, but at that point she was already fried out, shut down. She didn't trust that anybody would hear, and it would be worse. Why am I going to say anything? It's an unconscious decision too. So with him, the investigator's asking him, well, how did you do this murder of another woman? And he's convinced that it was an accident, da-da-da-da. All of a sudden, this guy switches. As they get into the details of the traumatic event, he switches and he starts talking about himself in a third person. And he says, Johnny, it wasn't Johnny who did it. Now, the investigator has no clue what's going on. And he probably thinks, it's just an employee and blah, blah, blah. And that's generally where people take it. They don't want to get too deep. He's a murderer. Let's lock him up. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. But how could somebody be capable of this? It's the split off. So then he starts talking about Johnny didn't do this. It was the demon inside him. Then he asks them to draw the demon. So this is like really deep therapy work that this guy's doing, whether he realizes it or not. He draws this demon. It's this black circle. It has horns, etc., etc. And he says, this is the demon that lives inside him. Now, was the man a Christian? Can Christians have demons? Was there a demon living inside him? That's the first thing I thought of. Is this guy a Christian? Is he saved? Can he have a demon? Now, it could have been an alter or a part of his mind that's convinced that it's a demon, but it's not. It's just some part that has this sick fascination with all these horrible things, potentially from something that happened to him in his past, potentially satanic ritual abuse, right? Maybe he as a child was meant to do really horrific satanic type things, and some part of his mind is either recreating it to heal from the trauma, or these cults that do this often convince the kid, you like this, right? They'll guide the child's hand over a knife as they plunge it into the chest of usually an animal at first, and then sometimes a child like their friend. And as the blood's coming out, they'll tell them, you're evil, you like this, don't you? And the child will ingest that. They will internalize those messages and believe it. Of course, why wouldn't they? It's such a traumatic mind control techniques, right? Trauma-based mind control. Also, there are adults. Oftentimes the parents are involved. Parents are God to children, essentially. And that's biblical as well, right? We should become like little children and trust God. So they internalize these things. And so sometimes there's a part of their brain and their psyche that says, I do like this. I want this thing, right? So potentially that's what we had going on with this guy. The parts were coming out. As the investigator leaves him there, gets the confession, leaves, the guy is left in his other altered state. And he keeps saying, I didn't kill her. I didn't kill her. And he's convinced. He's not acting. I understand some people might say, he's just acting. Again, there's no chance of him getting out. There's no point of him acting. He only came to this point when he was completely in a trusting environment. Then the alters were able to speak and say, yes, this other part of us did it, right? If he kept going, he might have talked to the part that did it. Yeah, I did it. She deserved it. Women are blah, blah, blah. This is blah. You know? And that there's what they call an unholy belief in the charismatic world, but I kind of like that terminology. It's an unholy belief because of something that happened to them. And if you dig into the trauma, the altar holds the memories, and they can tell you, yeah, this really horrific thing happened to me, and because of that, I now believe. And usually it's in a younger part that will talk. So, all that to say. All right, let me circle back around here. It's a lot of information. So when the investigator leaves the room, the guy is saying, I didn't kill her. I didn't kill her. Like, he's really convinced. But he's struggling with it because now the truth of the situation is being brought to his, what they call the front person, or the prominent personality, which is like him, who he presents as. So himself is struggling with it now. I didn't do this. I didn't do this because he didn't remember. But because the other part spoke and brought that information to his front personality, he's left with it, struggling with it. And then as the camera's rolling, hidden camera, he's saying, well, I believe it was another part saying, you did it again. You did it again, Joey. Or whatever his name was, I don't remember. Right? You did it again. So you see these, he's saying you. Before that, he's saying, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. And then the other part of his, however you want to see that, the psyche says, you did it. Yes, you did do it. Right? So you see this situation. Who the heck is going to help it? Nobody even knows. Even in the documentary I'm watching, people didn't even pick up on it. You know? What to say, man? I've picked up on this stuff ever since I was a child. It is what it is. As far as society is concerned, I think we've reached a point where this is as far as we're going to get. I would love for a progressive society that would help humanity, help prisoners, help victims, you know, help the codependents, help everybody, have strict laws that would be properly priced, but also understanding and forgiveness in some situations. There would be help for prisoners, not just all these things, you know, prison reform, corrections reform, child abuse reform, stricter laws, but also understanding laws and what's going on, and understanding with children what happens when somebody, there's so much to learn and so much to do. I think it's done. I think society is done. We've reached the point where it's the best it's going to get. I believe that a lot of like what they call first world countries, Western countries besides America, have better understanding on those issues. And I think they do better. A lot of European countries, potentially a lot of South American countries, probably a bunch of that I don't know about. They've done education reform where they've, so in an ideal world, if Jesus wasn't coming back very soon, we would see these reforms put into place and we could get this place really nice and spick and span and working just a lot better than it is, let's say. I do believe there has been progression in society. However, I believe that the world is about over. Jesus is going to come to fix this thing. We've done the best we can, and it's now going to get worse. As we see with the MAGA movement, with the war with Iran, etc., things are progressively getting worse. And they will get worse. We've progressed to the best we can. We've given people certain rights, and now there's going to be a crackdown on all rights, and we're going to roll back the clocks to the Antichrist era. Now, there might be some things where there is a progressive angle of that. Oh, you're allowed to do, because the devil uses both. He uses licentiousness, yeah, do whatever you want, and on the other hand, he uses false religion to say, you better not do that, I'm going to kill you if you do that, I'm going to beat you. That's satanic. God always gives freedom. He says, this is what I prefer for you, and yet you make the choice, and there will be consequences. So yeah, guys, I just wanted to talk about that. I know it's like super, I don't know, horrible and tragic and gruesome, but I do feel like there was a lot to learn from that, especially from the Christian angle. You know, quick thought on, can a Christian have a demon? I don't know if that guy was saved. However, again, I don't know that it was a demon. Even though he was saying it was, his mind thought it was. It could be just something that his mind thinks about, but it's actually a part of himself. So oftentimes you'll see that in the deliverance movement. People will be casting demons out. Oh, that's a demon because, you're obsessed with blood, or you like the taste of blood, or whatever it is, You find out, no, they were abused as a child in a cult, and they were made and forced to drink blood. And humanly, you actually might start to like it. You might convince yourself you have to survive. And what really pisses me off about society is, when people from concentration camps, whether it was in Auschwitz or I forget that guy who wrote that book. What's that guy's name? I'm blanking on it right now. He survived a concentration camp, or there's prisoners of war who come back, these are grown-ass men, and we know how war, which is a traumatic situation, can literally split their minds. I learned this, I remember in high school I learned about this, about trauma and splitting off and dissociation, and they gave me essentially 3 examples. And this was basically a basic idea of DID and the basis on which DID is formed. Because in all humans, we have the ability to dissociate things. In other words, have what they call like repressed memories. Lock memories away, so we literally don't know that they exist. However, part of us still remembers because it did happen to us. And I don't care how young you were. Some people think you can't remember, before the age of 4. I can't believe that actually exists in humanity in this day and age, that people actually believe that garbage statement. I can literally remember when I was 2 and 3 in my preschool. I've recalled things that I told my dad that he was like thinking and how do you remember that? That sounds right. It's like, yeah, it's silly. People have said they can go back to their infant years and remember. So that's not true. But we went through these things, and part of us still remembers them. We may not remember